All right, let me get started here. Can everyone see this?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, so great. Welcome to the first ever GroundSource webinar. I'm Andrew Haig, the founder of GroundSource. I created GroundSource almost 4 years ago after a career in public media and co-founding the Public Insight Network. And I really felt like increasingly news was becoming a conversation, but it always had been a conversation between a media organization, the communities it served, and given the direction we were going with mobile messaging, with SMS, felt like the tools were becoming and the technology becoming more and more available to actually have a conversation at scale with your community in a way that we were never able to before. So that's why I set out to create GroundSource, and I want to tell you a little bit about why we're doing what we're doing, but also give you a kind of look at how it works, and then talk to some people who are actively using GroundSource to see how they're using it out in the wild. First of all, if you're on the YouTube stream, it's more delayed, and we can't actually see you. So if you want to participate directly in real time, go to the Google Hangouts link, and it's right here. It's this bit.ly link, gs_webinar1. So go ahead and do that and join us there, and then we'll be able to see you and participate in real time. Okay, so one of the core, these are our core beliefs, but kind of undergirding all of those is the notion of lowering the barrier to engagement. I feel like there's too much friction between the communities we're serving, the audiences we're serving, and our intent or our desire to engage them. Partially because other channels, social media and other channels are really primarily designed for broadcast and distribution and not for genuine two-way conversation. So it's fairly straightforward for us to get our content out there, but it's not fairly straightforward for us to establish direct connections with people in a way that can allow us to be in conversation with them. We really believe in the power of authentic feedback, meeting people where they're at, direct connections, and building relationships with them over time. A lot of journalism, especially as a journalist, when you go out into the community, sourcing is a very transactional kind of conversation. You're not building relationships necessarily with all the sources that you're speaking with. You're gathering information from them, you're using it for a story, and then you're moving on. We really feel like all those touch points that a news organization has with their community should be converted into building those relationships over time. But the biggest asset any news organization has is their relationship with their community, and we want to help you build that relationship. And finally, we want to help you meet people where they're at. Increasingly, that's not necessarily on our website, it's on their phone. And SMS is the most ubiquitous form of communication the planet has ever known, besides speaking to one another. It's an incredibly engaging channel. But also Facebook Messenger and other chat apps are kind of reaching that level of ubiquity in a lot of parts of the world and here in the US. And increasingly, we can't expect people to come to us. We can't expect to publish a story or broadcast a story on the air and instantly get audience. We have to go where people are at. But also, increasingly, or not increasingly, but we need to go out and speak to our whole incredibly engaging channel. But all Facebook, if someone's got the chat apps or stream going, could you mute that in the background? I'm getting a loop. Thank you. And increasingly, we can't. I might have to mute someone.
Oh, wait.
Okay, I think I don't hear the loop anymore. Okay. So meeting people where they're at means going out into the community, but also meeting them in the technology where they feel most comfortable. And that's increasingly messaging and chat. These are some of our customers. We piloted in dozens of contexts with many news organizations, and also with human rights groups, with nonprofits, with urban planning groups, with environmental groups. And we've learned a lot, not only about how the technology works and how to refine that, but how to build that community so you can engage them, how to do outreach, how to effectively talk to people, how to ask good questions, what to do with all the information when it comes in. So we've been learning a lot, and we're still in beta, and we're about to leave beta here in the next few months. but we're already kind of serving a lot of different types of clients and a lot of really interesting organizations that want to build outreach and engagement into the core of what they do, into the core of their journalism and their community work. So let me just give you a quick tour and show you how it works, and then we'll shift into kind of talking about some case studies and how it's actively being used. So let me switch over here. So this is GroundSource, and when you first start using GroundSource, the very first thing you need to do is get a phone number set up. So let me switch over to this group here real quick. So I've logged in. You log in with LinkedIn. That's just for you. Your contacts don't have to log in or anything. They just communicate with you. I've got a different number set up. I've also got Facebook Messenger integrated with my account here. So this number you see here is actually a Facebook Messenger ID. But I'll show you in a second. I've also got an SMS number set up, and it's really easy to switch back and forth between those. Once you've got a phone number set up, or in this case, a Facebook Messenger integration set up, you create what we call prompts. And those are back and forth that are automated between between your account and the people you're communicating with. So here's a back and forth or a prompt I created for the webinar. You give it a name, you give it some tags, which help you find people later on. You set the outbound number, and here, like I was saying, here's my SMS number here. Here's my Facebook Messenger integration. And once you've got that channel selected, you select a keyword, and this is how people initiate contact with you over SMS or Messenger. So if people were to text, and you could try it now if you wanted to, texting GS to 612-351-6630, and you'll get this back and forth, this prompt. But once you set that keyword, that's what you use to promote your this channel or this texting or this SMS number or your Facebook Messenger bot. As you build up communications with people out there, as you build your base of contacts, you can build lists out of them. Much like if you've used MailChimp, there's a lot of similarities between what we've done here and MailChimp, in that you can kind of build and segment your lists over time, or you can just send out to everyone. So I've got some lists here that I could choose to send out to, but in this case, I'm just going to set it at 0. And initially, when you have no contacts in your list, you'll just use the keyword to initiate contact. You can also upload sources. And this is where you kind of build your questions, your back and forth with people who are communicating with you, with your contacts. There are different question types. So there's a text type. You can pick one, like yes, no, or a 1 through 5 type question. You can ask for audio, video, pictures, and then a message closes out the conversation, or it's just a message not requesting any form of feedback. So oftentimes we'll finish our back and forth with a message. So in this case, I've got a little welcome introductory message. I always like to put my name on them. It's good to personalize them and keep it really conversational. You can add links, and then I ask the question. So when you text into this phone number, you'll get this message and this question. When you respond to that question, you'll get this one, and so on and so forth. One thing to note here, you'll see I can add media files, and this allows you to send out images along with your questions on Facebook Messenger. It doesn't work yet on SMS, but I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. So here's the next question. We like to keep it to 2 or 3 questions tops. These are not surveys as you typically or traditionally think about surveys. Surveys are often 20, 30 questions that take 20 or 30 minutes to get through. This is meant to be the start of a conversation. So you may have a bunch of questions for people, but you really want to keep it to the few questions that you think people will be able to answer relatively quickly, and that people will appreciate as part of the start of that conversation. So when people text in GS, they get this first question, and so on and so forth. And then at the end, like I said, you close it out with a message. As people communicate, and then I'll just show you what it looks like over on Facebook. So I'll text in or message in DS to Facebook Messenger, and I'll get our image that I set there. And the first question, it's where do I live and what do I do? What do I do for a living, and where do you work? And then as you answer, it prompts you with more questions, just like we set up in that workspace. And then the choose one in Facebook becomes a button question. I'll just answer these to get through this. And then that's the final message. So back here, I'll go back to our feed. So these are the answers I just provided. Now, as a journalist or a producer, I can communicate directly with that person from the feed. I also see that they've got a source profile created for them, and I'll show you what that looks like. So every time, the moment someone messages or texts into your account, they have a profile that's created for them. And as they communicate over time, that profile gets richer and richer. So you can see everything that they've shared with you. You can see their basic demographics. You can see their areas of expertise, their occupation, all these. I test everything, so I have a lot of tags, and you can see their location as well. The really cool thing about Messenger is that the moment someone messages into your instance of your Facebook Messenger bot, we'll capture in GroundSource their full name, their location, their time zone, and their gender, and that'll all be automatically pulled into their profile in GroundSource. So it's a super powerful way of developing a base of contacts, and then you can segment them and learn more about them over time. Then I'll just show you this real quick, just so you can see that. See all the contributions that I've provided over time. I'm gonna take a second to load. So going back here to my sources page, I can see all the people I can communicate with here. I can see them by geography. I can select them. I can segment them by any range of criteria down here, or I can search for tags that I know I've created with certain prompts. And then finally, as responses come in, I can, oh, there's my daughter there. These are all the responses I've shared over time. See, there's an audio response. And this is everything, I test everything, so that's why it looks like that. And then I'll show you just an instance really quick of the feed embedded on an external site. So with each response, I can also press publish, and that will create a feed that's embeddable as an iframe on another website. I'll put that. I'll let that load. Any questions, at least from the Hangout crew or in chat, about kind of the interface itself? And then I want to switch quickly over to talking to Jesse about the listening post project, because we don't have him for that much longer. Let me just show you this. So this is an example of the feed embedded on a site, and it's all mobile responsive. So this will show up really nicely on mobile phones. And then we'll get to this later, but you'll see that when you structure your exchange or your back and forth with your community in the form of really thoughtful questions, you get really thoughtful, high quality responses. And I can't emphasize that enough. We see over and over again across all of our different deployments of GroundSource that when you ask good questions, you get good answers, and people step forward and share experience, and they share something of themselves. And I just feel like that's a treasure trove for journalism, but also for building trust with the community. So let me switch out of, let's go over here. So now I want to talk to, I want Jesse to talk a little bit about the listening post project. This is a 3 or so year old project in New Orleans. That's really been a ground up community-driven media project that Jesse Hardman, the founder of this project, has created from scratch. And GroundSource is a component of this project. It's not the whole thing, but texting is how Jesse kind of keeps this relationship up with people out in the community. So let me switch over to the Hangout and then see if we can get Jesse's space up here. Okay, where are we? Let me present Jesse to everyone here.
Hey,
okay, there you are.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. So I'm in New Orleans, based here, and this project a little over 3 years ago with the goal of kind of learning a little bit about how information gets passed around in New Orleans and what are some of the more organic and really simple ways to get news to people that's kind of essential to them in the city. So kind of news under the umbrella of jobs, education, health, civic type issues. So those kinds of topics. So kind of identifying what are the things folks would benefit from knowing, and then creating some engagement concepts around those topics to get people having a conversation. So when I started this, I did what I call an investment around the city to different community events and community spaces just to kind of see where people were already sharing news and information with each other, and have them fill out a really short survey that told me a little bit more about how they normally share news with their community. So I learned a lot, and cell phones certainly came up as one of the main ways people were getting and sharing information. And even anecdotally, sitting with people in their houses here, you don't necessarily see a home computer in every house here, and I'm sure that's the case in the communities you all live in. I spent a lot of time at the public libraries, and that's where a lot of folks were going to get online, but everybody did have a cell phone. So that felt like a really direct reach out to people, let them know one thing that might be useful news-wise, and then get a sense of their experience with that thing. So cell phones kind of immediately seemed like a good strategy for doing that, because my goal was to reach a lot of the neighborhoods here in New Orleans that aren't heard from as often. And as people here, there's a real affordable housing issue here, get pushed to the periphery of the city, cell phones has been a way to kind of keep up with them and keep track of them. Even though you're not engaging them in the sense of like seeing them personally on a regular basis. And yeah, so over the course of the last couple of years, it's been a bit of a dance of figuring out what are people's tolerance levels for hearing from me, what are their tolerance levels for the kinds of questions, the number of questions to send them. I think I've got the news piece right in terms of I'm a reporter and I have a decent idea of what's happening in the city in any given week. I've spent most of my time figuring out how to craft questions that are accessible to people. So not just throwing big concepts like, say, gentrification at my audience and saying, what do you think of gentrification? But giving them an example that they might relate to, and then asking them how they dealt with that situation. And the more I've kind of developed questions that ask people specifically, how did you deal with this? Or what was your, experience with this? I've really started to get some great anecdotal, in-depth information from folks, and people become sources for a radio program that I do for the NPR station here. And so it's been a really interesting experience to kind of find ways to get people to text the number that I have here, and then once I have kind of an audience, to reach out to different ways to follow up with them, and maybe not rely on the phone so much, but it was a way to kind of get in front of people all over the city, even though I'm running the project and occasionally have one or two other people helping me. It's been a really nice way to kind of spread out and be in neighborhoods that I normally wouldn't have time to reach out to too often.
Hey Jesse,
yeah.
Jessica in Sacramento, California wants to know what kinds of questions you ask, or what some examples of questions you've asked.
Well, recently, since Katrina, New Orleans has really had an amazing number of huge $1 million development projects go up around the city, and some of these projects are finally getting finished, and people are starting to see whether or not they benefit from them. This was extending a streetcar, so not even light rail, but kind of more of a trolley line to a different part of the city, which cost $40 million. And so the question was, well, I was letting folks know this streetcar is now running. It cost $40 million. And then the questions related to, I gave people a list of big development projects all over the city. And I said, which one of these do you interact with, and how do you interact with it? And then the follow-up question was, thinking of these same big projects, what's a project that you feel like hasn't benefited you or your community as much? So it was giving people both an opportunity, to let me know what's going well, but also like what's kind of a white whale in the city. And I had a sense of how people might answer. There's a market here that was developed in a very traditional historic building that people had a lot of attachment to, and it's clearly too expensive for people who traditionally live in that neighborhood. And so I heard a lot about that. And I heard about some things that I wasn't as aware of. So that's a topic. It had a news peg. The streetcar was being unveiled. Before that, I talked to people about the voter registration deadline. And like a lot of southern states, Louisiana has low turnout, and also there's a lot of folks who just aren't registered. So the news headline was, the deadline's October 11th, and here are some places you can go to do that. And then the question related to, was a question actually I borrowed from National Public Radio, which was, what do you want the next president to know about your life? And it's a beautiful question for this kind of project because it really asks people something personal. It's treating you as an expert on your experience, so it's giving you an opportunity, to be heard. But you also, as a reporter, you just get so many interesting little details about people's experiences in the city. This is a majority Black city, so there was definitely a groundswell of comments related to the last 8 years have been awesome, relating to having a Black president. And I think people here are feeling very unsure of what the next 4 years, the next 8 years will be like for them, having had this experience from them. So that was a really interesting question, especially to share here in a majority Black city. So those are a couple of the last two examples.
A couple things I wanted to add to that is that I think you put out a question recently around, I think it was affordable housing, and you heard back from every neighborhood in the city.
Yeah, I don't think she's on the call here, but there's a woman on the Jersey Shore, Kelly Shaw, who's been working with me, and she's created her own listening post project on the Jersey Shore, which is geographically a very different place. So she and I kind of talk every couple of weeks about topics and questions we're interested in. And we were trying to figure out what's a really kind of ideal time to reach out to people during the week. And Kelly kind of developed this idea that Wednesdays at around 3:30 or 4 were perfect because people are kind of ready for the weekend. They're not quite there. And Thursday, they're probably going to be trying to work a little harder so they can leave on time Friday. So Wednesday, late afternoon was kind of this perfect moment to reach out. And the first time I tried it, it was a combination of the topic, but also the timing. I asked folks, I gave them the formula that HUD uses for affordable housing. 30% of your income going to housing means, or more, means it's not affordable. And so I asked people, what percentage of your income goes to housing? And of the 12 100 people get messages from me. I heard from 100, which is the most I've gotten, which is close to 10% return rate. And I heard from, I asked people what neighborhoods they lived in. I not only heard from every neighborhood in the city, I heard from neighborhoods I didn't know existed, which was useful. So yeah, it's kind of, I think, point number one for me is, how do I frame a question in a way where people feel included? I think a lot of our questions as journalists and also as people interested in community engagement, even if they're a who, what, where, when, why, or how question, oftentimes suppressed information aren't as inviting as we think they are. So I spend a lot of time really thinking through and testing out with people I know, how's this question going to come across? Seeing how people will answer before I kind of finalize it and send it out. And then once I kind of craft that question and I get it out into the world, I get all this feedback from the city, which is fun. It's kind of like, Christmas, looking into the Christmas tree. You've got all these interesting variety of responses. And then from there, it's kind of piecing together, okay, well, what did I hear here? What's kind of standing out to me? And who might I benefit from following up with to understand a little bit better? And that could be a short answer or a long answer. Sometimes somebody simply letting you know where in the city they are is really useful. Because it may be a neighborhood you don't hear from as much. Yeah, and then kind of following that narrative and seeing where it takes you. And maybe that's useful to you as a reporter, maybe it's useful to you in terms of thinking about how your media outlet needs to reach out differently to different communities. Where I'm, really trying to focus on finding people and developing a longer term relationship with them. And, so that's been really rewarding. And then when I go and meet them, I get to ask them how the project, because I don't know half of the people who participate. I have no idea how they join. So it's fun for me to kind of find that out.
So I think I've talked to a lot of newsrooms, and I think one thing that comes up again and again and again is that there's a really strong desire at many newsrooms to do more engagement and to do more outreach, but it comes down to a question of time, and resources and priorities, I guess, are part of that as well. But what tips would you have for people to start some version of this without feeling like they have to dive in as deeply as you've gone, but still get some benefit out of doing this kind of work in their community?
I think keeping it small. So if I were to start this, or as I help other people start these sorts of things, I think starting super small. So I would pick one community, or even one part of one community that you feel like you don't know as well. And who in that community kind of has the ear of the residents? Where do they communicate with those people? Is it through like a city, kind of council type arrangement? Is it through the local library? How are they kind of getting their audience in their community? And how can you get to know that person, which ultimately hopefully leads to you getting an opportunity to also get in front of that community and kind of explain to them you think it's important, to kind of engage and have a conversation. And I think one thing I really feel strongly about, I spent a lot of time going to neighborhood meetings and kind of sitting in the back, and usually I get 2 or 3 minutes to explain what I'm doing. And I bring a sign and I kind of explain, that this is through a public media outlet, and a lot of the neighborhoods I'm in, that's not something people are really connecting to. And just showing up without an agenda, without a microphone, without a notepad, and just kind of listening, I think, and having people see you in the room, I think there's a real just basic impact there. And the more you go back and you become a presence, I think that gives people confidence that you care, because I think one of the parts of the modern newsroom is the lack of resources and staff to kind of really develop relationships. You just don't have time, or you're not given time to, really dig in often. I'm not saying that's everybody's example, but the sense that a lot of people are struggling with that. So with this, it just kind of forces me to, spend time listening to start. And I noticed that, that's kind of going about it the right way. People appreciate it when you do it that way. And,
there's a question from John Spady in Seattle about whether you broadcast statements that you get from people back out to the community somehow.
Yeah, so I have this radio program called The Listening Post, and I read some of the text messages I get. I also have these things called listening posts, which are statues that I put out in the community at libraries and community centers, and they have the same questions and news kind of headline that the text messages do, so people can see that. They can press record and leave an audio message for me, and that goes into the radio program. I'll share a link with you. So the goal is that this program explores a topic, but that it sounds like the city. It sounds like you're hearing from around the city when you hear the show. And that's something that, public radio often struggles with. So the goal is to kind of, reflect back what people are thinking, how they're experiencing certain issues. And one other thing I've tried to do, and I should do more of it because I think it's a really good experience, is inviting your audience to share questions with you that you can then take somewhere. So a couple of weeks ago when I did my show on voting, I know that 70,000 Louisiana residents can't vote because of prior convictions, which has got to be one of the highest rates in the country. 1,000 people who are not in jail who can't vote, who can't exercise that right. So I asked people what they thought of that, and I brought their comments to somebody who can't vote. And it was a really interesting exercise for him to see what people thought and to respond to it. So I think there's also an impact in you kind of representing this community that you're creating and taking them with you to, talk to the mayor, to talk to somebody like this guy who's, formerly incarcerated. And you're bringing them with you, and my hope is when they can hear that kind of loop close, that they feel like they were on your team, and I think that hopefully creates a longer term audience and addresses some of the issues that I think people really have found frustrating with kind of online comment sections and spaces like that. This is meant to be really, kind of longer term engagement.
It's actually a really good segue, and I want to respect your time, Jesse. So it's and we've only got about 20 minutes left, so I'm going to move on to some other pieces here, and then we can take some more questions later on.
And I will I'll send some follow-up links, Andrew, you can share with the audience here. But thanks for your questions; those were great.
You want to put your email in or your contact info in chat there?
Sure.
All right, let me switch back to my presentation here, and then I'll just kind of walk through a few more. So here's the listening post. So I think Jesse's the listening post is just a really special project. Really proud to be a part of it, and it's I think it's tremendous. I think it's the kind of thing we ought to be doing more of. I also understand that it's intensive, and it takes a lot of it takes someone like Jesse who kind of understands these things, who's got some time. I wouldn't say it takes all that much time. He's been cultivating this over a period of years. But I wanted to show you some other examples that maybe give you some other ways into using the platform and also thinking about how it might be used. A newspaper in Virginia, the Virginian Pilot, the debate over the extension of the light rail system there was in Virginia Beach, was getting really nasty, and the comments online, they had to shut off the comment section, and they wanted a way to get feedback from the community that was higher quality, that was more thoughtful and more based in experience. So they posted this number in their newspaper, and they put it on their social accounts.
Jesse, you're not sharing. Andrew,
I'm not sharing.
No, you're not.
Oh,
I see your face. I don't see your.
Present to everyone, but not. Okay. How about now?
Yes, thank you.
Yes. There we go. So they put this phone number in the newspaper. They also put it online. They got about 90 responses, and editors and reporters were really impressed by how thoughtful they were. Let me see if I think I have them up somewhere else, but and so they embedded the feed of comments on their site, and then got people talking through from their experience about not just their kind of off the cuff opinions, but also to what extent those opinions were based or formed from experience. So structuring that feedback was very helpful in this case. I think another great way of using is kind of just what I was saying is on top really difficult hot button issues to gather people's experiences versus versus them trying to win the argument in the comment section. In Macon, they used it to gather perspectives around the debate over gun control. And here's the back and forth that they created. A very simple question to get into it. Do you own a gun? Yes or no? Anyone can answer that question. So a really easy way into the conversation. And then this question, why or why not? What have you experienced that shapes your attitude towards guns? And then after that, a few questions about gun control. And they got back really amazing responses. They had people who worked in corrections, who had seen people die of gun violence, and who believe there ought to be tighter gun control laws. But when you get to their opinion, you've already read some of their experience, and that their opinion carries more weight with it because it comes from a place of experience. A person who grew up in a hunting family, and I think that's very common, especially in the South, that have generation after generation, either hand down heirloom guns, or to have that culture of hunting and in using guns be passed down through the family. But this, you might think this person with that experience would also be, clearly potentially against gun control, but actually, this person is talking about having a more stringent vetting process. So a really nuanced opinion that comes out of some lived experience. And then finally, it doesn't always have to be these long responses. Just putting the phone number out there and inviting people into the conversation, it signals to people who may not have felt welcomed into the conversation before that they can raise their hand and share their experience. So here's a woman whose son was killed walking to the gas station, and then she was teaching her other kids how to use guns because they were scared for their safety. And this is not a person. And then the Georgia Public Broadcasting did a story on her and her family. But this person didn't, tell a big long story and didn't really, this is not something she probably shared in social media anywhere, but because the channel was open and because someone asked, she stepped forward to tell a bit of her story. And I think she felt comfortable to do so, even though she maybe, didn't feel like she either had the time or the inclination to sit down and write her whole family story. In Colorado Public Radio is doing a lot of outreach right now with using GroundSource, both on the text messaging side of things, and they've been getting a lot of perspectives on the minimum wage debate. But they've also done something really cool lately. You can use GroundSource just to accept or gather voicemails as well. It works the same way as text messaging. When you call the number, you get the back and forth initiated, and then text questions. What would be a text question with SMS turns into a voicemail question. So they've been broadcasting on air for people to call into this number. They've had, I think, more than 100 people call into this phone number, leave their voicemails, and they've produced at least one radio story, fully fledged radio story, purely out of the audio they've collected through GroundSource. So in this case, it's actually a time saver. You're gathering, pretty much radio quality audio through GroundSource and putting together a story that you can put back out in the air. So the outreach, the engagement, all those pieces do take time, and maybe that's added work, but in a lot of cases, gathering input from the community or gathering voicemails from the community can save time. And now they've got all these sources who they can go back out to on other stories. When you're first starting with GroundSource, outreach is how you get people to start communicating with you, and that could mean everything from what the Virginian pilot did, printing the number in newspaper, what Colorado did, broadcasting it out over on the radio. In North Dakota, they're gathering stories about the Dakota Access Pipeline, but also the oil producing areas. They've got these signs that they've been sharing on social media. They're also handing out business cards and sending out messages to their Prairie Public Media, sending out messages to their membership list. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get that phone number and get that channel out into the community. This is a sign from New Orleans. Jesse's created some really engaging signs that don't always have to do with anything in the news. It just be a way into the conversation with someone in the city. And now with Facebook Messenger, you can create your own custom Facebook Messenger buttons that'll link right to Messenger, and then people can engage there. So there's lots of different ways. Also, events are really effective ways, as Jesse was saying, at getting people to respond. Milwaukee Public Radio used GroundSource at an event on gun control as a way to get questions from an audience of about 1,400 people, and they've got several dozen people to share their questions that way. Also through community partnerships, working with communities, community organizations that already have some trust and kind of access to a community, and they can spread the number for you. And that's part of what we provide as GroundSource. Part of at a certain level of subscription, and we can talk about pricing later if you want to. We will spend time with you, kind of helping you come up with a good outreach and engagement strategy. We can have weekly calls with you to kind of check in on various things and kind of get you headed in the right direction. In our experience, after about 3 to 6 months, as few as 3 months of working with you week in, week out, the ball starts moving really, that you've got a lot of momentum, and people start to understand that this is a really effective channel into your newsroom, into your organization. Univision is using the Facebook Messenger integration to create bots, and then they're broadcasting or promoting those bots on their Facebook pages. During a recent soccer tournament, the Copa America, they activated a bot for people to communicate with their Deportes page, their sports page. So when people message into it, they got automated messages back. They got reports about each team in the tournament, and then they could go deeper with each of those teams and learn more about the team. And then they could also share their experience. So people were texting in, insulting the referees and, talking about their team and that kind of thing, the kind of thing you would do during the middle of a soccer game. But they're also sharing where they, were watching the game. They shared pictures. It was a really, I think more than 1,200 people were corresponding with their bot once they activated it and made it public. It was a really effective conversational channel to open up during a live event. And this was just before Lionel Messi stepped up to take his penalty kick, which he missed. And you can see that this is how one of the fans of Argentina on this page decided to express himself this way. So there's just so many different ways you can deploy this kind of use this kind of conversational engagement on Facebook pages through SMS. But once you've got the channels open, people will respond, and they will respond in ways they don't in social media or in comment sections. And this is our core value as an organization, that we want to help news organizations and other organizations engage their community so that the community can see itself better, so the community can understand itself better. And I really like that quote from Arthur Miller. Sorry, I just got a phone call. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now, and then if you have any questions, now's a good time to ask them. In chat, if you're on YouTube, you can do it in chat, or if you're here in the Hangout, you can you can just speak your question and unmute yourself.
To what extent this is John in Seattle, to what extent do values play into the community conversation? As a journalist, do you listen for those and try to get an understanding, or are values a little bit too squishy to try to understand the different points of view in a community? And that's a question for everybody.
You want to add, John? You want to add a little more detail to that? What do you mean by values in this case?
Everybody has, I think, a different way of seeing the world. They all have their personal points of view. Some of those would resonate more broadly with the general public, and perhaps some of those would not generate very broadly. I'm curious as to trying to discover what drives the community forward, what engages it, what are the core, and I'll use the word core values of a community, and how widely those are reflected among different demographic groups. So I'm interested in seeing a conversation with a community that tries to understand itself more fully, and to allow people to realize that they're not, isolated one-offs, but they might be part of a broader sense and a consensus of opinions and values on certain topics.
Yeah, I mean, other people can step in and talk about this too, but I do think one of the perverse effects of comment sections and other forms of engagement, and they're not all like this. There's a lot of really effective comment sections, and on specific kinds of stories, you get amazing kind of knowledge surfacing in comment sections. So I'm not black and white on comment sections. I think I read a lot of comments, and I think they're really valuable in a lot of contexts. But in areas where the values of a community are up for debate, I think it's social media and comment sections are not they're kind of funhouse mirror reflections of what the community's actually feeling and thinking. And I think the role of GroundSource in this form of engagement is to really try to tap into some genuine sentiment in the community, and see how that sentiment is born out of actual experience. And I think that takes a lot of the heat out of the debate, and it kind of puts people in a place where they can kind of have some empathy for one another. I think the gun control example is a great one. I think if you were to, especially in the middle of Georgia, where they were engaging people around this question, it's really easy to put people in, one of two camps, like very pro-gun, Second Amendment, NRA, or very against guns. And what that drew out is a much more nuanced picture of the community. And because you could see people's experience, you had more of a basis for feeling like, well, I could really sit down and talk to this person, and it's not like we're going to be nose to nose on this, and we're going to disagree vehemently, which is what typically happens in stories like that in the comment sections. I want to bump to a couple other questions here before I get too far down that line. So Steve asked if there's an API for integrating. Yes, there is an API. We've documented it. It's a RESTful API, and we can talk about how to use that more effectively to flow information coming out of GroundSource into your site. And Lindsay Abrams asked if this GroundSource is used to interact with the national audience, and it definitely is. I think it's a question of how you get the phone number out there if you want to do it by SMS. With Messenger, I think it's much more. Messenger might have a lot more potential for doing that, because then you can drop the links to Messenger or buttons to kind of engage with Messenger throughout social media, on Facebook groups. But yes, it's being used to engage nationally as well as locally. And Jessica's wondering how we've evaluated GroundSource projects, what the stated objectives, and how do we measure outcomes. So I think the listening post is a good example, because we're kind of in the middle of deep diving into all the data we've collected on that project over the past 3 years to come up with a really good sense of what our metrics should be. Certainly, when it comes to unsubscribe rates and quit rates, that's one metric that we use to evaluate projects, and that's always remained really low, provided organizations are asking questions and not using that channel to simply promote the content, or if people see it as an actual exchange, it's very unlikely that they're going to quit that exchange if they see it as relevant to their community. But also the ability of an organization over time to build enough of a base of contacts to be able to feel like they can sustainably talk to a community and get lots of different perspectives. And I think that's one we're keeping an eye on. I think that a lot of the onus for that is on the outreach portion. And I think if you can get through that phase of outreach and getting enough people to communicate with, the chances are very, very good that you're going to be able to have a sustained conversation with that group of people, and they're going to find it valuable. So we've had a lot of different pilots in a lot of different places with different objectives, and we're now kind of looking back as we kind of prepare to exit beta to figure out like what are the best metrics to determine the health of any implementation of GroundSource, from how fast could they build a base of contacts, what are the response rates, and I think the one that's a little bit harder to measure, a lot harder to measure, is the quality, which I think is the key differentiator between this and other forms of communication and engagement, is that you're meeting people where they're at, you're asking them questions and drawing out substantively different kinds of responses than you do in other channels. And I think that one, I think we can probably put some measurement to that, and think about like how do we measure that more effectively. But I think that in a kind of metrics-driven culture, it's a little hard to make the argument for quality and substance, but I think that's where we rise above a lot of different other forms of engagement. What are the questions? Any other questions? So I wanted to show you one other. We're making some updates.
There's one question from Jessica there that she added.
Oh yeah, I think I just answered that one. Oh, how long or short should questions be? So in terms of asking questions, as far as we can tell, the best practices are, probably no more than 3 questions. That the first question, especially if you're using it to drive outreach, should be really easy to answer. I've sat with people as they've gotten their first prompt, and whenever the question is a little too heady or a little too in-depth or asked too much of them, it's not that they're not interested in answering. It's that they say, well, I can't really come up with an answer right here on the spot, so let me think about it. And the thing about SMS is, like, if you think about it and you say you'll do it later, the chances are you won't. But if you get people engaged with a really quick question that they can answer in 5 seconds or less, the chances they're going to stick around and answer the rest of your questions is quite high. So the question of gun control: do you own a gun? Yes or no? Easy to answer. Second question: what about your experience shapes your attitude towards guns? If that was the first question you'd asked, I think you would have gotten very little response. But because they asked that first question, they got several dozen responses, and they were very, very good. And then, having some very simple question, a little bit more in-depth question, and maybe 1 or 2 more questions after that, and then a message at the end of it that thanks people and says, here's what we're doing with the responses, and here's a link to our website. So I think that's as far as we can tell. I'm sure there are cases in which those rules can be broken, but that's as far as we can tell kind of a best practice. All right, any other questions? I just want to give you a sneak peek at new functionality that we're going to be rolling out here in the next few weeks. Jessica's asking an automated thank you. Do you tell them how to hear or see the response? Yes, if there is a site where you're publishing responses, then I would share that link. The other thing I forgot to mention earlier is that when you press publish on someone's response from the feed, they get a notification back to them saying their response has been published. So they get immediately notified and drawn into that space. Let me just quickly share something with you here that we're working on. So this is our kind of sandbox, our testing site for new functionality. And functionality we're going to be rolling out in the next couple weeks. In the survey world, it's called branching or skip logic, but basically it allows you to have separate conversational streams based on how people are responding to prompts. So if someone says yes to a certain question, you can direct them down into a different follow-up than if someone who says no, just to use a very simplistic example. So I'll just show you what this looks like in practice. So here's a really simple question: how are you doing? Great to badly. Anyone who says great skip them to question 2. Anyone says really good to question 3, so question 4, and so on. So someone says, I'm doing great. And then you can say back to them, so good you're doing, so glad you're doing well. What is it about today that's making you feel so good? So just imagine that in a lot of different contexts. I'm creating some kind of mock-ups of news quizzes that people can do. But that gets us much closer to this notion of bots, which is where we're heading. This kind of automated, intelligent exchange that by and large can be left to go on its own. And then at a certain point, as a journalist, you can step in, or as a producer, you can step in and see, I really want to talk to people who are doing badly today. I just want to, I'm doing a story about the weather and I want to talk to all the badly people. So as a journalist, you can watch as your different buckets fill up with people who fit different criteria, but you can also deliver content to them that's much more targeted, because you can say to all the badly people, maybe you give them a poem or a song or something to pick them up that day, or all the great people, you ask them a question that you could share with other people who aren't doing so well. But I think that's going to allow for some really creative uses of the platform that are much more kind of like what we consider bots, like an automated, intelligent exchange. So that's a little preview of that. That's coming out fairly soon. If you want to get signed up for beta, I'll happily schedule some time with you in the next couple weeks, like a half an hour, to kind of give you a bit more of a guided tour to talk about what your engagement goals are and to see whether we can be of use to you. But we're up against time here. Unless there's any other questions, really appreciate joining for our first webinar. We're going to have more of these in the next several months as we roll out a beta, but I really appreciate your time and attention. Thanks, everybody.